Imagine pulling into a gas station on a lonely stretch of highway, just another stop in the middle of nowhere. Or picture yourself working the graveyard shift. You glance around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the station is eerily empty, and the world outside feels distant, almost unreal. There's an uneasiness that settles in your bones, the kind that only comes when the night is too quiet, too still, and you're left alone with your thoughts. There's nothing obviously threatening, but a quiet tension lingers in the air, and sometimes, the most unsettling moments happen when nothing seems to happen at all. The night shift at the gas station always had a way of stretching time. The ticking of the clock felt louder in the quiet, each second dragging like molasses. I had been working here for the past 6 months after I lost my previous job. I didn't mind the isolation, not really. There was a strange comfort in knowing you were the only person awake for miles around. The flickering fluorescent lights above me and the hum of the refrigerator units were the only things keeping me company. The gas station was just off the highway, far enough away from any major town to make it a necessary stop for long-haul truckers, road-weary travelers, and the occasional drifter. I'd see them come in tired and bleary-eyed, grab their snacks, cigarettes, or coffee, and then disappear into the night. I never asked where they were headed. It wasn't my business, and I didn't care to know. But the nights where no one stopped by were the worst. Like tonight. No cars had pulled in for the past 3 hours. Just me, the faint sound of a passing truck every now and then, and the darkness pressing in against the windows. I flipped through my phone absent-mindedly, trying to ignore the creeping unease that came with such deep silence. It was almost like the world outside had ceased to exist. At around 2:30 a.m., I decided to take a break from staring at my phone and stepped out to the small back patio where the employees sometimes smoked. The cold air hit me like a slap, the bite of autumn sharp against my skin. I zipped up my jacket and leaned against the wall, looking out at the empty parking lot. There was something about the way the gas pumps stood so still, illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. They reminded me of grave markers, silent and waiting, their hoses curled like dead snakes. Beyond the pumps, the highway was nothing more than a dark strip of asphalt, vanishing into the horizon. A rustling sound caught my attention, a low scraping noise. I turned my head slowly, scanning the lot for movement. The sound came from behind the station, near the dumpsters. I figured it was probably a raccoon or some other animal scavenging for food, but for some reason, my stomach tightened. I walked to the edge of the patio, peering around the corner toward the dumpsters. The shadows there were thick, impenetrable, and I couldn't see a thing. The rustling stopped abruptly, and the sudden silence felt heavier than it should have. Probably just some animal, I muttered to myself, but the words did little to ease the knot in my chest. I lingered for a moment longer before heading back inside, locking the door behind me. Back inside, the gas station felt different. The familiar hum of the refrigerators now seemed distant, almost muffled. I glanced up at the security monitor hanging above the counter. The screen flickered, showing the grainy black and white feed from the outdoor cameras. The lot was still empty, the pumps silent, but something about the footage bothered me. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Everything looked normal, the pumps, the highway in the distance, the garbage bins, but then it hit me. The shadows were wrong. The way they stretched across the pavement, long and distorted, didn't match up with the lights. I shook my head, chalking it up to the low-quality camera. But when I glanced back up at the monitor, just for a split second, I saw a figure barely visible at the edge of the frame, standing near the farthest pump. The figure was still, almost blending into the darkness. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I rewound the footage, trying to find the moment when the figure appeared, but no matter how many times I watched, there was nothing. The screen remained empty, the lot desolate. I told myself it was a glitch. Old cameras like these weren't exactly reliable, and it wouldn't be the first time I'd seen weird distortions on the feed. But as the minutes passed, I became more and more dizzy of the feeling that something wasn't right, like I was being watched. The doorbell chimed suddenly, the shrill sound cutting through the quiet. For a second, my soul left my body, my nerves on edge. A man had walked in tall and gaunt, his clothes hanging off him like they didn't quite fit. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. "Hey," I greeted him, my voice shakier than I'd intended. "Need help with anything?" He didn't respond at first, just walked slowly toward the counter, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, barely above a whisper. "Do you know what time it is?" I glanced at the clock. "It's just past 3. The man stared at me for a moment, his eyes unreadable. "It's later than you think." I frowned, unsure of what to make of his comment. He wasn't acting aggressive, but there was something off about him, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. "You need gas or something?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door, his footsteps eerily silent. As he stepped outside, I watched him through the window. He didn't go to his car. There was no car. He just stood by the pumps, staring out at the highway. I swallowed hard and I glanced back at the security monitor, my heart reluctant to keep up. The man wasn't on the screen. The lot was empty. I looked back out the window, and he was still there, standing completely still like a statue. My pulse quickened. How could he be there, but not on the monitor? I stepped away from the counter, unsure of what to do. The longer I watched him, the more wrong everything felt. The man hadn't moved an inch. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket, locked the register, and left. I didn't care about protocol, I just needed to get out. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The man was gone. What the heck? Now I was seriously terrified. Where could the man have gone? Why wasn't he being seen in the monitor? I told myself to just stay calm, stop imagining things, and focus on the driving. But then again, I wasn't imagining. I saw the man. He came inside, was standing right across me. All these weren't imaginations, I know. It wasn't a long ride back to my home. I stayed relatively close. But that ride seemed endless. The trees outside, the occasionally dim streetlights, the moonless night sky, the cold but prickly breeze, everything outside felt different, as if they had a different story to tell. Finally, probably close to an hour after. Well, I don't know, I didn't keep track of time, just assuming at this point. I reached home. A sign of relief rushed over me. I got out of the car, but too afraid to look back. Just got out, left the car behind, rushed inside, slammed the door, and turned the lights on quickly. It just added an extra layer of security knowing that I'm inside my own house, far away from what I had witnessed some time ago. But then, why am I thinking about security, I told myself. It was just a man who came inside, didn't speak a word, took a leave. Why did it bother me in the first place? Maybe it was because he wasn't being shown in the monitor, or I didn't see him in the rearview mirror of my car. But what if the glitch was real? What if the man had left even before I noticed my car's rearview? I don't know, all this was going inside my head. Maybe it's the night I told myself. I was tired to my bones. I thought I'll just quickly freshen up and go to sleep and get myself to work tomorrow like nothing happened. But the feeling of what had already happened in the present still lingering in my thought. After a long night, longest I would say, I just threw myself to bed, turned the lights off. Sleep had a special charm. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall asleep after a really tiring day. Moments after I closed my eyes, in a minute or two, I heard soft footsteps downstairs. Downstairs? Someone got in with me, was my first thought. Is it the same man from the station? Did he got inside the car with me? Who knows? I was too scared to go down and look, but after all I had to. My heart hammering in my chest. Hello? Is anyone downstairs? I called out in a soft tone. No reply. Also, the footsteps sounds had dismissed itself after I called, which made me even more terrified. It was complete silence at this point. I got out of bed, getting down the staircase. As I reached halfway, suddenly I heard a loud bang on my door. I jumped, my breath racing, trying to catch up with my heartbeat. As I stood there still, dumbfounded and terrified, the loud bang turns into knocking on the door. I called out, "Hello?" But the knocking continued louder. I ran back to my room, locked the door, and tried to call the police. But as I did, I think I heard the door knob downstairs thud open. Working at a gas station off the interstate, you get used to the weird hours and even weirder customers. I've been at it for a few months now. The graveyard shift mostly, where the silence is only broken by the occasional hum of passing cars and the distant roar of a semi. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and for someone like me, someone who preferred to keep to themselves, it was perfect. The gas station was old, the kind you'd see in a forgotten roadside movie, with cracked tiles, a sagging roof, and a flickering neon sign that cast a dull glow across the parking lot. It wasn't much, but it had a kind of charm to it. It was my routine now. I knew every creak, every hum of the refrigerators, and every time the front door's bell would jingle. That night, everything seemed to go as usual. The clock ticked slowly toward midnight, and I found myself staring out at the empty highway, waiting for the next car to pull in. But something about the stillness outside felt wrong. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little noise. The sound of the wind against the windows was low, a dull hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I could hear the faint tapping of my own fingers on the counter, and even the buzzing of the old fluorescent lights felt louder than usual. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another slow night. But then I noticed something strange. The cars that usually passed by, heading toward the next town over, weren't there. The road outside was completely deserted, not a single vehicle in sight. It wasn't long before I saw headlights in the distance. A car moving slowly, too slowly for the highway. It was as if they were deliberately taking their time, creeping toward the station. I watched as the car rolled into the lot, its engine idling for a moment before shutting off completely. No one got out. I waited, expecting the driver to step out, maybe come inside for gas or a snack. But the car just sat there, motionless. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside, but I could feel eyes on me. I glanced at the security monitor, but the feed was glitching, flickering between static and distorted frames of the empty parking lot. The car wasn't showing up on the screen at all. My stomach tightened. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, but I tried to play it cool, hoping it was just a technical malfunction. I stood there, staring at the monitor, waiting for the image to stabilize. When it didn't, I turned my attention back to the window. The car was still there, engine off, no movement inside. The longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I became. The stillness of it was unnerving, like a predator waiting in the dark. I wondered if I should go outside, maybe check if someone needed help. But my gut told me not to. Something wasn't right about that car. Minutes passed, each one dragging longer than the last, and still, no one emerged. It felt like a standoff, as if the driver was waiting for something. My hand hovered over the phone, debating whether to call the police. But what would I say? There's a car sitting in the parking lot. It wasn't exactly an emergency. Still, I sensed that something was terribly wrong. And while all this was going inside my head, a series of rush thoughts, the bell above the door jingled, breaking the silence. I jumped, my heart pounding, but when I turned, no one was there. The door had opened slightly, just enough for the cold night air to creep inside, but the parking lot was still empty, except for that car. I hurried over and shut the door, locking it this time. I went back to the counter, my eyes glued to the car. My fingers drummed against the counter, the only sound breaking the silence. I could feel my pulse quickening, the tension building. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each second dragging by like an eternity. Just as I was about to pick up the phone, the car's headlights flickered back on. The engine rumbled to life, and the car slowly backed out of the lot, its tires crunching against the gravel. It drove off into the night, disappearing down the highway as if nothing had happened. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I glanced at the security monitor one last time, the static cleared for a moment. And there, this time I saw a car parked in front of the parking lot. The same car which was not showing in the screen all this time, the same car which disappeared into the night a few moments ago, was now very much visible in front of me, on the monitor, but not outside. I was terrified. How could my mind play so many tricks all at once? Nothing seemed right. Nothing seemed logical. I was looking at different screens in front of me, hoping to find something. What if a man had gotten out of the car? Or a woman? Who knows? But anything that I could find to not test my sanity. As I was hovering over different screens, for a moment in one of the monitor, I saw a dark shadow-like figure standing right behind me. I blinked, and the monitor flickered back to static. I have had enough. I locked up early that night, leaving the station before anything else could happen. But the memory of that shadowy figure haunted me long after I drove home. I couldn't explain what I saw, and the next day the security footage was blank. But I know what I saw. I knew the figure was real. And whoever or whatever was inside that car, I had a feeling they'd be back. It was supposed to be a straightforward late-night drive, a routine journey back from visiting my parents in the countryside. But what happened that night at the gas station was far from routine. It was an experience that still haunts me to this day. I set out at around 10 p.m., hoping to beat the traffic and get back home before midnight. The night was dark and starless, the kind that seems to swallow all light and sound. I drove along the lonely highway, my car's headlights cutting through the inky blackness. The hum of the engine was the only thing keeping me company. About an hour into my drive, the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low. I hadn't noticed how much gas I'd used on the way to my parents' house, and now I was in the middle of nowhere with an almost empty tank. I scanned the roadside for a gas station, but the stretch of road seemed endless and deserted. Just as panic began to set in, I saw a dimly lit sign in the distance, a gas station. Relief washed over me as I pulled off the highway and into the station's lot. The place looked old and run down, but it was open, and that was all that mattered. The gas station was eerily quiet. The single fluorescent light above the pumps flickered intermittently, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The small convenience store was illuminated, but I couldn't see anyone inside. I parked my car next to the pump and got out, the cold night air sending a shiver down my spine. As I began to pump gas, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from behind the store. I tried to shake off the unease and focused on filling the tank. After what felt like an eternity, the pump clicked off and I returned the nozzle. I decided to go inside and grab a snack for the remaining drive. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, but the store appeared empty. Rows of dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with outdated snacks and drinks. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But my voice seemed to be swallowed by the silence. Just as I was about to leave, an old man emerged from the back room. His appearance startled me. He looked ancient, with deep-set eyes and a gaunt face. His clothes were worn and dirty, and he moved with a slow, deliberate gait. "Evening," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hi, I just need to pay for the gas," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded and slowly made his way to the register. As he rang up my purchase, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Traveling alone?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah, just heading back home," I answered, trying to sound casual. "Be careful on these roads," he said, handing me my change. "Strange things happen out here at night." I forced a smile, nodded, and quickly left the store. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I got into my car and locked the doors, taking a moment to collect myself. Just as I was about to start the engine, I saw something move in my peripheral vision. A shadowy figure darted behind one of the pumps. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, but there was no one there. Trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, I started the car and pulled out of the gas station. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but the darkness seemed thicker than before. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the old man standing outside the store, watching me leave. His eyes seemed to glow in the dark. I drove for about 10 minutes, my mind racing with thoughts of the old man's warning and the shadowy figure. Suddenly, my car's engine sputtered and died. The dashboard lights flickered, and the car coasted to a stop. I was in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and no idea what to do. As I sat there, trying to figure out my next move, I heard a soft tapping on the window. My blood ran cold as I turned to see the shadowy figure standing just outside the driver's side window. Its features were obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I fumbled for the keys and tried to restart the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I locked eyes with the figure, and a sense of dread washed over me. It slowly raised a hand and pointed towards the gas station, as if urging me to go back. With no other options, I decided to heed the figure's silent command. I got out of the car and began the long walk back to the gas station. The road was pitch black, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my feet. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. When I finally reached the gas station, the old man was gone. The store was dark, and the only light came from the flickering fluorescent above the pumps. I called out, but there was no response. As I turned to leave, I saw a piece of paper taped to the door. It was a handwritten note, scrawled in shaky letters. "She's coming for you. Run." I felt a sudden urge to run, to get as far away from the gas station as possible. But where would I go? My car was dead, and there was no one around for miles. Just then, I noticed a narrow dirt path leading away from the station into the woods. Desperation drove me to follow it. The path was overgrown and treacherous, but I pressed on, my heart pounding in my chest. The further I went, the darker it became. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to grab me. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned building. It was an asylum, long since forgotten and overtaken by nature. The sight of it filled me with an inexplicable dread, but I had nowhere else to go. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and broken furniture littered the floor. As I explored the asylum, I felt a growing sense of unease, as if I were being watched. In one of the rooms, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. I looked up to see the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. This time, I could see her face. It was twisted in a grotesque expression of rage and sorrow. I couldn't figure out if it was real or am I hallucinating. I was terrified. She pointed at me. Suddenly, the walls around me began to close in, and the room grew colder. The figure stepped closer, and I could feel her icy breath on my skin. I tried to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. The shadows around me grew darker, and the figure's eyes glowed with a malevolent light. I screamed, but no sound came out. To this day, I don't know how I escaped that night. The next thing I remember is waking up in my car, parked in front of the gas station. The sun was rising, and the old man was nowhere to be seen. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from the horrors I had witnessed. The gas station is still there, a beacon of light in the darkness, but I never went back. The memory of that night still haunts me.